So JavaScript does have this idea of objects, although if you're used to formal object-oriented programming languages, you'll find it very basic. It has a few very straightforward ideas about what makes an object. And we've already been doing it. If we make an array, that's an object. If we make a date, that's an object. These objects are self-contained pieces. If I have an array, I can use the dot operator to say I'm interested in its dot length. In this case, it would be 5. If I have a date, I can call methods of it. Again, these are functions that belong to an object. So I can say get time or get full year. And as soon as we start touching our web pages, we'll have other objects that represent all the different pieces of the page, what's referred to as the DOM or document object model. And we can even make our own. So we're going to get comfortable working with objects. And at its core, the idea of an object is really simple. It's just a container that gathers together some data and some behavior. So we know how to make variables. We know how to make functions. An object just allows us to gather variables and functions that belong together and give them a name. So let's say here I'm making some regular variables: player name, player score, player rank. It's just creating those 3 in memory. And I realize that really these belong together. It would be nice if I could enclose them in a larger object. Now I could do this in an array, but I don't really want to have to worry about the 0, 1, 2 whole idea. So what I'll do instead is I'll run this line. First off, I'll say var player, again I'm still creating a variable, equals new object. This creates me a generic object container and calls it player. What I then do is just decide what do I want the internal pieces of this object to be. So in this case, player.name equals Fred, player.score equals 10,000, player.rank equals 1. So when we do this, our data is now one level deeper. It's inside this player object. So we use what's called dot syntax to say this object dot this variable. Although officially speaking, when they're outside an object, we call them variables. When they're inside an object, we'll call them properties. A property is really just a variable that belongs to an object. Now, because it's quite useful to do this, the same way that there's shorthand for creating arrays, there's also a shorthand for creating an object. I create a new variable, I'll call it player1, and I use the curly braces. Now here, I'm not using them to surround a if statement, code block, or in a while loop. This is a shorthand for creating an object. And then inside the curly braces, I use this name value pair. In this case, 3 sets of information: name, colon, Fred, comma, score, colon, 10,000, comma, rank, colon, 1. And it creates the object and those properties inside it. And then I could just do another line of code and create player2, use the same format, but create a different object with different properties. And in this fashion, I could get to player1.name, I could get to player2.name, player3.name, and so on. So if we create a couple of objects, it's very easy to then write out information about each individual object. In this case, we'll write out console.log for player1.name. That reaches inside the object and writes out Fred. But it'd be nice to do a bit more to this. What I'd also like to do is associate some behavior with these objects, not just some data, not just some information, but what can player 1 do? What can player 2 do? What would be nice is if we could create a function called, say, player details. And that one, I'll just put a comment inside this right now, that this should display information about each player. Now, sure, what I could do is just define this function independently and declare it as accepting a parameter, but I'm not going to do it that way. What I'd like to do is make this function part of these 2 objects. And the way I need to do that is to associate it with the objects themselves. What I'm really doing here is making this a method of my objects. So what I'd like to be able to say is, say, player1.showDetails or player1.logDetails, and have it called this function. I'm associating this function with this object, and it's completely up to me how I want to do this. I'm going to say player1.logDetails. You might think, well, where did this come from? I'm just making it up right now, and I'm setting it equal to player details, which is the name of the function. I'm not calling it here. I'm not calling that function at all. I'm just associating it with my player1 object. And similarly, what I want to do is exactly the same thing with the player2 object. So what does this do? Well, now both of these objects actually have a method called logDetails. And if we call it, it will just reach through and call the playerDetails function. Okay, so what? What will it do? Well, I'd like to actually, let's just do a console.log message here. Information about the player. And if I think, well, I want to write out the name of the object, but I don't know whether I'm going to be doing player1.name or player2.name. I just want to do one at a time. And I could call this for either. Well, here's the thing that we do. If I know this function is going to be associated with different objects, what I can use is the word this to refer to the current one. So whatever object it is, I'm going to go into its name property, or its score property, or its rank property. So I'll put together a bit more of a message. This.name, and a little string, has a rank of, and then we'll use the concatenation. And just to make it clear, I'll split it across a few lines. This.rank. Close the console log parentheses, close the semicolon. Now, right now, if I ran this code, nothing would actually happen because I've defined the function, I'm creating the objects, but we don't have any information coming out. What I can do sometime later in the code is finally call the logDetails function of player 1 and the logDetails function of player 2. And we're going to use the parentheses to let JavaScript know, yes, we're actually calling it now. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And we get the message out here. Fred has a rank of 1 and a score of 10,000. Because it's calling it on Fred, it's jumping in and saying, what does this logDetails do? Oh, well, it calls playerDetails. And that's this function here, which for the current object, this.name is Fred, this.rank is 1, this.score is 10,000. And I could just call that for the second object. And then we get the second message out, which is that object's information. For those of you coming from more formal object-oriented languages, you're almost certainly recognizing that JavaScript seems very casual about this. There's not a lot of rules being enforced here. And yes, that's true. We can just kind of go ahead and make these objects and tie functions to them. It all seems quite loose and flexible. Well, that's JavaScript for you. And know that JavaScript doesn't have formal classes as other object-oriented languages do, but you can emulate the same effect using a normal function and something called a prototype, but that's not necessary for us right now, so I'm going to leave it until later on in the course. Because most people, most of the time, don't need to get really deep into object orientation. This will be more than enough to get us started. Because knowing this, knowing that the idea of objects, the idea of properties, the idea of methods, allows us to move on and start working with the really important objects in JavaScript. The window object, and particularly the document object, the most important object for any JavaScript developer.